Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us in the show, live show. And you're listening to the United Public Radio Network, FM 105.3 and 107.7 global. I mean, we go around, I guess, all around the world in a lot of countries, and they listen to us. So this is a great network. This is a Strange Reality with Dave Emmons. My guest today is Mr. David White, and he's a fantastic guy. Had him on the show before. Michelle DeRocha, our producer tonight, she does a fine job. She's a great lady, and she's high up there in the podcast thing. And I was doing a show, and David was on my show on Facebook, and I put it out to other platforms. But I was asked if I was nervous doing large audiences, and I said, no, not too nervous. You know, I'm just trying to keep my hand. No, I'm not nervous. But no, it's we get a large audience on here, and I call it, when I was doing the show on Facebook, I call that cracking peanuts. You know, so yeah, I'm glad to be on the show, and Joe and Michelle and other people on this network, been great people and helping me out quite a bit because I need production help, especially when it comes to all this fancy technology and stuff. And David and I think David's a very sharp, intelligent guy. I don't think he even does producing. Do you, David?
Producing?
Yeah.
No.
No. Okay. All right. So we're both in the same area there. I'll tell you a little bit about David White. This show is going to be covering UFOs, ancient archaeology, Metaverse, and Knights Templar. I think we might get to that. It was the topics earlier, but now he sent me another thing, some other topics he wants to talk about. But here is David White, and he's been on my show before, and I know it, and I know he's one hell of a writer too. I've seen some of his, I guess you could call it English literature, how he wrote it. I can't write like that. I got 3 books, and I wish you would buy those books also. I'm trying to hawk those books. But David, I've seen his sampling of writing in English literature, and I said, oh my God, I can't write with all that kind of color in the words and stuff, but he does. David White studied at Northwestern University and was lucky to study briefly with Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the noted Project Blue Book astronomer and UFO researcher. Since then, he's written numerous screenplays, novels, and short stories. I told you he was a writer, and authored research papers on UFOs, the Pentagon UAP videos, ancient archaeology, megalithic architecture, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight, military and political history. And this guy knows it because he studies it. If he doesn't know it, he's going to research it, and he's going to come back with it and tell you all about it. The Metaverse, the Ark of the Covenant, and the Rennes-le-Château, and the Knights Templar. David is an experiencer, and we talked about that before on the show, and they've heard some of his experiences with the ETs and Bigfoot, and he's had quite a few synchronicities, it looks like. Because of what he's witnessed in his life, he can say with complete certainty that yes, paranormal experiences do exist, that our planet is indeed being visited by non-terrestrial intelligences, and that time travel, at least through psychic or dreamlike means, is not only possible but probable, more common than we realize. And I know they do have time travel that we don't know about. And he's given me a bunch of talking points. I'm going to let David kind of introduce himself a little bit and fill in some of the things that I might have left off and what he's doing presently. And then I want you to tell us how you got your start. I got a list of things here of synchronicities and things that you've seen, Bigfoot, ETs. You can kind of go off onto that and explain the start. And then we're going to get into the meat of the thing, the articles that you wanted to talk about earlier. David White, what do you got to say?
Thanks for that long, lengthy introduction. I want everybody that's listening to this to understand I'm just a researcher. I'm just like anyone else out there. I don't have a degree in archaeology. I never even took any classes in archaeology. I made sure that my 3 kids learned that the most important thing school is supposed to teach you is how to learn. And that once you leave school, you should continue trying to learn. We'll learn more interesting stuff once we get out of school than we've ever learned in school. Okay. Right. The second thing I want people to remember, and I want them to pass this on to everybody they know, there was a writer by the name of Alvin Toffler, who is sort of a futurist, sort of a science fiction writer, but he wanted to perceive where America and the world were going to go in the next 30 to 40 years. And he had a quote that I thought was really important that I've tried to live my life by. His quote was, "The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who can't read and write, but those who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn." And we're at a point in civilization right now where we thought we knew everything. We thought we'd learned all we needed to learn. And every year we're learning more and more things, but they're replacing the things we thought we knew before. The James Webb Telescope is showing us a vision of the universe that appears to contradict what we thought we knew. So we're now having to unlearn a lot of the astronomy that we thought was important and relearning it. And one of the other great areas besides astronomy where we're having to unlearn and relearn is archaeology. There is a furious debate going on online about the actual age of civilizations across the earth. And there is a kind of a battle between traditional archaeology and amateur archaeologists like myself. However, the evidence is clear that civilization is far older than we thought just 30 years ago. 30 years ago, you could have gone to any archaeology department in any university, and they would tell you that the earliest civilization was circa 4000 BC. And it sort of appeared simultaneously in Mesoamerica, South America. We're now learning through LIDAR that there were vast civilizations across South America throughout the Amazon River basin that we're just now learning about.
David, what you're saying, what you're saying is, summing it up, is what I say is history is not what we think it was, or what we know what it might be. They're telling us wrong, right?
Right.
Who's
right.
telling us wrong? I mean, what is it all about?
The problem is we are taught by the people who learned before us, who were taught by people who learned before them. But the more recent researchers and investigators are uncovering information that wasn't available 30 years or 60 or 90 years ago. So those people are now having to, as Alvin Toffler suggested, they're having to unlearn and relearn. And it's really hard once you've spent 40 or 50 years in one particular science regimen to unlearn what you thought was true. And that's always going to be a challenge for humans. Unfortunately, that's where we are right now. We're having to unlearn stuff. There are two primary groundbreaking, earth-shattering revelations that we've come across in the last 30 years that's really turned archaeology upside down. The first is that we are now very certain that the end of the Lesser Dryas, which was a period of heavy glaciation across the earth, ended around 13,000 BC, first with a dramatic increase in temperatures, and then with an equally dramatic decrease in temperature. We believe, although it's not proven to the geologists' confirmation 100%, but we believe that the Lesser Dryas ended with a massive solar body, crashing into the glacial ice sheets in the northern part of Canada, possibly across Greenland, and maybe also all the way into Russia. It appears that
was that the Great Flood they're talking about 12,000 years ago, something like that?
Yes, there appears to be evidence that the ocean levels rose as much as 300 or 400 feet in as little as a month or even 2 weeks in places. We know this now because there are coral that have a lifespan that only exists 3 or 4 or 5 feet above the ocean and 3 or 4 or 5 feet below the ocean. So they live in that area where they can get both oxygen and water. And these seem to have all died at a certain point where the ocean levels rose, considerably above them, 200 or 300 feet. So we can tell where they were 10,500 BC. And we can see how quickly that rose.
In Noah's time, like during Noah's Ark, they were warned by God that this catastrophic flood was going to come. Did they know?
Okay. So here's one of those unlearning experiences. So the story of Noah from the Bible, from Hebrew writing. That story is recorded sometime after Abraham leaves the city of Ur, between 1500 and 600 BC. There are people that claim that the earliest Hebrew documents were written when Abraham left, but we don't have any evidence of that. In fact, the oldest documents we have in Hebrew come from around 500 or 600 BC when they were in captivity in Babylon. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Up till then, it seems very likely that all of those stories were recorded orally and transmitted orally from generation to generation.
And it's older
Those
than what we
stories
think, right?
that may have, sorry, go ahead.
Is it older than what we think? 12,000, probably maybe 60,000 years ago?
Not 60, but maybe 12,000 years ago. So the city of Ur was one of 5 holy cities that the Sumerians had that they had to rebuild after a great flood. Now, this rebuilding occurs approximately 4000 BC, which is also the time of the Egyptians called it the Zep-Tepi, which is when it's called the first time. It's when the ocean waters, or whatever waters were there at the time, receded and left the first land, which we think now might be the knob that was carved into the head of whatever being was there before the Sphinx. And then later on, that knob was carved out around it to make the Sphinx enclosure. And it was carved later on after that into the head of a pharaoh who found it thousands of years later. Okay, so we have.
Yeah, let me ask you a couple of questions. I've been hearing some fantastical things, David, about our length of time and how often we've been here and gone, the human race. Some scientists are saying like 3.5 million years ago, actually the human race started here. They were here and gone, here and gone, here and gone through catastrophic incidents. And they said 60,000 or 65,000 years ago, the Anunnaki, what they did, they DNA engineered us or manipulated our DNA. What do you have to say about those fantastic stories?
Well, to go back to the story of Noah, the story of Noah is actually a retelling of a Sumerian story that might have been their record of the legends of the flood that happened 10,000 to 10,500 BC. So when the Sumerians are recording these stories, these may be retellings of legends from 6,000 years prior to that. Okay, that's how old some of these stories are.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about the Nephilim and the Anunnaki, those also might be from that same 10,000 BC time period. And it's not until Abraham leaves Sumeria, leaves the city of Ur, and travels to the Holy Land and then into Egypt, that they finally get written down. But by then, 8,500 years has passed, and they've gotten some of the details a little jumbled.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's quite possible that we are hearing now about the worldwide flood. We're beginning to find evidence that there may have indeed been a worldwide flood. I was saying that so the end of the Lesser Dryas is one of the great new discoveries we've made in the last 30 years. The other one that's really been groundbreaking in archaeology is the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey.
That's interesting.
A lot of people don't realize Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated site. There are 2 or 3 dozen other sites in that area
Mm-hmm.
that use different amounts of stone pillars. Some of them use the T-shaped pillars that you see at Göbekli Tepe. Many of them are just vertical pillars without the crosspiece. This was an ongoing process that lasted for maybe as long as 1,500 to 2,000 years, where they kept building circular enclosures, and where those enclosures were, people settled. But this is 6,000 years before we used to think civilization first arose in Mesopotamia or in Egypt or in the Hindu Valley or the Indus Valley or in China.
And David, I heard you mention something about the Great Flood, how it started. Are you convinced through your research that it started by a meteorite? I heard that the Atlanteans had a war with another ET race, and they bombarded them and then caused the whole world to kind of disrupt, I guess, with nuclear weapons that they had or lasers. that caused that great ice melt. What do you think about that, David? I mean,
Well, one of the most interesting pillars at Göbekli Tepe is one called Pillar 43, or the T-shaped Pillar 43, which has a carving of a carrion bird. We think it's probably a vulture, which is connected with their reverence for the sky. So the vulture eats the bodies of the dead people and carries it up into the sky, sort of into heaven. Which is very similar to the Native American belief, which is why they would put their bodies not in the ground, but on top of a elevated structure, so the carrion eaters could eat them and carry them up into the sky. But this carving of the vulture looks remarkably like the constellation Cygnus. And right above one of its wings is this big globe, which we think might have been an indication of wherever this object was that came in and hit the Earth. It doesn't appear to be a meteorite, because meteorites almost always have a telltale signature of the kind of metal that the meteorite was made from. And we don't see any indication of that at this time period. However, there is indications throughout North America of teardrop-shaped, oval-shaped, elongated debris fields as far away as South Carolina and Nebraska, that if you correlate them back into a path where they seem to intersect, it appears to be somewhere around the Wisconsin area. And it probably was a comet, most likely not a meteorite, but it seemed to have caused tremendous destruction if it's sending, debris over 1,000 miles away. Mm-hmm. And one of the other things that's really interesting is there has been noted finds of mammoths in northern Russia that we can tell they were eating flowers. They were eating wildflowers when they died. And they died so suddenly that the flowers were still in their intestines undigested. But it seems like they were flash frozen, which to me sounds like whatever hit those ice sheets sent, tremendous amounts of cold air and ice into the areas where the mammoths were living and flash frozen.
So that means that it was probably not a meteorite, but you're talking a comet. And the comet has is frozen. It's got a lot of frozen material in it. Yeah.
Got a lot of debris. They call it a dirty snowball for a reason.
Yeah. Right. Now, that's you think that's what's caused. Well, you hear these stories, biblical stories about God said that he wanted to get rid of the Nephilim and the giants because they were bad, and he just wanted to cleanse them of the earth. And this is where the Noah story comes in. So they were after the giants and Nephilim. Apparently, they had this regular humans for lunch. From what I heard, they're pretty mean characters. But what do you know? I heard you mention the Nephilim, but what do you know about the Nephilim back then? And did they really cause God to strike back?
Well, there are only two strong sources where we can read about the Nephilim in the Bible. One of them is in the books of Enoch, which are not accepted as the traditional view of history, because there's too many wild accusations about Enoch being in heaven and seeing all the denizens of heaven. So the early church fathers didn't want to include that in the rest of the books of the Bible. The only other places we see them are in Genesis and a couple of other places, and they are not described very well. They're not mentioned very well. The Nephilim may be a faded memory of the Anunnaki, which is a Sumerian term, which talks about basically a family of gods, very similar to what we'd see from like the Greek pantheon or the Viking pantheon, where there are competing interests between the people who are in charge. You sent me a link this week of two gentlemen who were discussing the term Elohim, meaning the Lord's plural in the Old Testament. When the Israelites settled around Jerusalem, there was one tribe, the tribe of Dan, who basically got control of Jerusalem and the temple. The other 11 tribes spread out around the rest of the land. The tribe of Dan worshipped only one God, Yahweh or Jehovah, while the other 11 tribes worshipped a pantheon of gods, a family of gods called the Elohim. And we can't really see that in our English translations of the Bible, but if you look into the earlier translations, especially the Aramaic texts, or even something like the New Jerusalem Bible, some of these other ones that don't use English, King James versions of the English language, which don't have a plural form of verbs, then you can see the earlier verbs which have a plural form, like they did this or they caused this to happen, rather than he or Yahweh caused this to happen.
Right, David, but my book that's going to be released before long is Angels and Supernatural Entities. I cover some of that in the book. It said Jesus told the disciples, when the Nephilim come back, that will be the next end of the world, like in Noah's days. And that's in the Bible. And I don't have that biblical. I don't want to say anything biblical unless I really know for sure what verse it is. But he said that. He said when the Nephilim will be back at the end, we don't know the end, but he said they will be back just like they did in Noah's days. What does
keep
that
in mind,
mean?
there was about 30 or 40 years ago, there was a group called the Jesus Project that tried to figure out what seemed most likely that Jesus actually said and what things that were attributed to him were added on later. And they estimated that only about 30% of what the New Testament claims Jesus said that might have actually been words that he said. And the other 70% are things that have been ascribed to him since then.
Right. So this article that on this video that you and I shared, and you got grasp a lot of information from it, and that's why I was looking for your insight of what that meant. Could you sum it up what we saw that short video, David?
Sure. It was basically an etymological discussion about the term Elohim, and whether that was a plural term or a singular term. There's a great biblical author named Bart Ehrman, who I believe wrote the book Who Wrote the Old Testament. And we can now tell through extensive research that there were 5 authors for the 5 first books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Each one of those had a different primary author. But there was also another author or an editor who has been given the nickname Q. And this editor compiled all the different stories from the 12 tribes. And there are primarily 2 competing stories. That's why you have both the story of Adam and Eve living in the Garden of Eden, but Eve being born out of a rib from Adam.
Right.
But then there's another story that says, oh no, they were made out of the mud of the earth and made to look like in God's image. There are 2 stories of the flood. There are 2 stories of Noah, because the 11 tribes who worship the Lords, plural, the Elohim, had one view of history, one view of their ancestry. And then there was the tribe of Yahweh, the tribe of Dan, who followed Yahweh, who had a slightly different, much more focused version of history.
And so Adam had a first wife, Lilith. Her name was Lilith.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
she disobeyed Adam, so she was thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And she
Which
became
is
what you
interesting
call a
because
witch.
that parallels the story of Yahweh having a consort who also was cut out of the record books. At one point, for whatever reason, they decided they didn't want Lilith anymore. They didn't want Yahweh's consort. So they sort of somehow magically bound her in a tree and burned her in front of the temple in Jerusalem to signify she was cast out of the pantheon. We don't hear that story very often, but that's apparently the original tale. But again, these stories that we're getting from the earliest Israelites, from Abraham's time, from 1500 BC to about 500 BC, I believe those are echoes of the Sumerian stories, because we can see a story about Noah in Sumeria that follows exactly what Noah supposedly is doing.
And it mentions Enki and Enlil, or whatever.
Yeah.
Enlil, yeah.
Yeah.
And those are actually Noah's, I guess, grandparents or their bloodline. Was that right, David?
According to the Old Testament, perhaps. But according to the Sumerians, they were the 2 rulers that were part of the Anunnaki who came down to Earth from somewhere else. We're not exactly sure where this somewhere else is. If you read Zecharia Sitchin, he claims they come from the 12th planet. And we could get into a whole discussion about this this dark Earth that might be circling the universe that's, you know, 5 or 6 times the size of Earth, and it's disturbing planetary bodies in the Oort cloud, where we can tell there's something way out there, and it might have a 3,000 or 4,000 year periodicity where we won't see it for 4,000 years, and it'll swing through the solar system.
Yeah, David, this video also is actually alluding to the fact that everything that's in the Bible, we're actually extraterrestrial. We're involved mostly. Is that right?
That's what the Sumerians seem to suggest. Here's an interesting little tidbit. So the Sumerians had knowledge of the stars that they could not have possessed through their own understanding. For example, they had a term that meant light year, that they could measure the distance not from place to place in the sky, but from star to star. Like if you had a 3-dimensional view of the Big Dipper, you'd notice that some of the stars are closer to us than the others are, and they're all moving in different directions. Somehow the Sumerians knew the distance between those stars, but they didn't have telescopes. So how could they have known this? Okay,
right.
That's problem number one. Problem number two is they had one of the most advanced measuring systems where they used the 360-degree system. They apparently used a base 12 system as well. Now, the reason we use a base 10 system is because we can count to 10 on our 5 fingers. Were they studying from some beings that had 12 digits, and that's why they use base 12? It's great that 360 is divided by 2, by 3, by 10, by 36, by 12, by 20. It's much more divisible than something that's base 10, which is really divisible only by 2, 5, and 10.
Well, the Nephilim had 6 fingers and 6 toes, from what I understand. And this dark planet that you're talking about, is that Nibiru? That maybe that's
Nibiru?
Nibiru.
That's what some people believe. We haven't seen it. We can't find it. The only reason we think it's there is because there is some disturbance in a few bodies in the Oort cloud, but they're so faint, it's really hard to tell what caused this. But there seems to be evidence in our own solar system that we have been invaded, let's say, by extrasolar bodies, which did things like flipped Venus backwards, put Neptune and Uranus in slightly different orbits than they would be, and sent Pluto in an almost, not quite, but very close to perpendicular orbit. So something very big came through our solar system. There's also the story in Sumerian legends of Tiamat, the dragon god of the sky, who attacked the other gods of our solar system. And that's why we have, for example, the moon was part of an extrasolar body that crashed into the Earth, and part of it flew away and reformed around the Earth as the moon. We now know that there is some undigested portion of whatever this planetoid was still inside the Earth's not solid mantle. And we can actually now measure the density of this material that's still inside the Earth that came from whatever the moon was. And the reason that we needed to go to the moon and bring back moon rocks was to prove that at least the covering of the moon is made of the same rock that the Earth was. So we know that that material was once part of the Earth. So it wasn't something that we captured that came from out of our solar system. It was part of Earth and reformed as the moon.
What do you think about Admiral Byrd when he went up there in the 20s and he found an inner city? And they said that there's an inner Earth.
We're skipping all over the world on this, aren't we?
Yeah, no, you're talking about you said the matter that's inside the Earth. I was getting to that point. To what could it be, an inner Earth like Admiral Byrd was talking about?
I guarantee you, if there was an inner Earth, either the Russians or the Chinese would have built a base there already.
Yeah, no doubt.
Sorry, I don't think there is. And the problem is, if you've got the kind of gravity and the kind of heat that's inside the crust of the Earth, you just can't have an opening. It just wouldn't work. Imagine trying to drill an opening in a volcano. It would just come up with more lava. We just can't have an opening in the earth. I think this was a great idea back in the 1920s and 1930s, but current understanding of the way the earth, in fact, all planets that we know of work, is if you have heat inside your planet, it's going to melt stone. The deepest diamond caves, I believe, that they have, diamond mines that they have in South Africa, go about 3 miles deep. And you have to pump air conditioning in there or the guys will be toasted. The walls are so hot that you will burn your hand if you put them on the walls. And 3 miles is about as far as we can go. Anything beyond that, and it melts the drill bits. So that seems to suggest there's no way that we would have an opening either at the North or the South Pole. It would just be too hot, and it would not allow a solid feature like a cave or an opening to exist.
Do you think that depth of heat is all around our globe, or could it just be in certain spots?
No, I think it's all around the Earth.
Really?
You know, here's another example. So there was a guy back in the 1920s, I think it was, who had the theory that the continents floated around, almost like parts of an eggshell on top of the Earth. And people thought he was nuts. They thought he was crazy. They laughed at him. He died pretty much in poverty and obscurity until about 20 years later, they went, hey, you know what? Wherever these continental plates meet, there are significant volcanic areas. The west coast of the United States, the entire ring of fire around the Pacific, the Mediterranean, South America, wherever you have these plates meet, you'll have a subduction zone from one underneath the other. And as that zone goes underneath and towards the heated material under the crust, it melts and comes up through the crust and causes volcanoes. That's why we've got this super volcano sitting where Yellowstone is, because it's the Pacific plate that's subducting the plate that basically has the mountain ranges of the western United States. And those volcanoes come up because of the subducted material melting underneath it.
Yeah, that's that caldera. Yeah, that's dangerous. Yeah. That's going to be really dangerous to have. Now, you mentioned the moon making of this. You know, the moon, you said 1,000? Is that the scientific? Yeah, okay.
Cross your fingers.
Yeah, maybe we'll be on another planet by then. Elon Musk could get us on another planet. But you were talking about the something inside, or you know, that comes in within our galaxy and rearranges planets and everything, and it caused our moon to shape and form. Now you've heard, I know you've heard these theories about the moon being hollow and it could be an ET base. What is your thought about that, David? We're talking about what you just talked about a while ago, so we're going to keep in line with that.
Well, the idea that the moon might be hollow came about because we have sent probes to hit the moon, and we find that it rings like a bell. Okay, but to be fair, the Earth rings like a bell too. And when we had that big volcano that went off last year in the Pacific, it actually reverberated back and forth around the Earth multiple times because it rings like a bell. So the moon does too, and I'm betting that any of the solid bodies in the universe, including Venus and Mercury and Mars, probably also ring something like a bell. But we know now from the moon rocks that it's made of the same material as Earth. So if somebody brought that into our solar system, then they would have had to dig up trillions of tons of Earth rock and deposited it evenly around the moon to give it that effect. And I just don't think that's possible. I think it with the evidence that we now have that there is an undigested part of whatever extrasolar body crashed into us and left part of it as the moon, I think that's pretty convincing evidence that this is what caused the moon. It was something that crashed into us and the debris formed the moon.
What do you think about, what's that, they call it Mooey Mooey or something, that big large cylindrical rock? Yeah. It had come through, what, a year or two ago?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, right. So I'm using Oumuamua in one of my stories where there's another one called Oumuamua Tua.
Oumuamua Tua.
Right.
Were there two?
And the idea is, and this is totally science fiction, totally something I made up, there is a civilization that's unhappy with our progress, and they were trying to hit us from some solar system many light years away, and they missed. And the second one goes right through our atmosphere and takes out only one satellite, and that satellite is from Fox News. And as soon as that satellite is obliterated, that TV station and all of their people that worked on them no longer exist. They're just gone. Like somebody wiped them out of history. But like I said, science fiction, fantasy story.
Yeah.
Um,
I was going to say,
the
wow.
problem, Oumuamua is actually a much more serious and dangerous event than we give it credit for. If that had hit the Earth, we wouldn't be talking right now.
Mhm.
I
Right.
mean, this would have been an extinction level event.
You don't think it was intelligently guided?
Well, what I know is that it appeared to leave our solar system faster than it entered. The problem is we didn't see it until it was already leaving our solar system. So I'm not sure that we know with 100% accuracy exactly how fast it was coming when it came in and exactly where it came from. There are astronomers that believe they know how fast it was, and they believe they know where it came from. But again, it would have been much better if we had seen it coming. The problem is, if something that big, 300 feet or more in diameter, can't be seen until it's already passing us, then we are spending our money on the wrong things. Because if that had hit anywhere on any continent, it would have been worse than the worst volcano in history. I mean, this would have, it wouldn't have been quite as bad as the one that took out the dinosaurs, but it would have been bad enough that it would have probably stopped all civilization for a few hundred, if not 1,000 years.
And would have sent us back a lot of years.
And the problem is, we can find these things if we put enough effort and money and resources into putting out detectors or building the better satellites out in space to look for these things, and having a fleet of some type of man-controlled vehicles out in space that can nudge these things away before they hit us. The one that blew up over Chelyabinsk was small. It's the size of, I think they said, a van. Okay. And it set off an explosion in the atmosphere that was bigger than the explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah,
And
it damaged windows and windows. Do you think NASA's being straight with us, David, about Mars and about all this other stuff in our galaxy?
Yeah, I've had a lot of discussions, quote unquote, arguments, some people would say, with people online. You've seen how difficult it is for even Elon Musk and SpaceX to get a rocket into space. We've seen how difficult it is with just something as minimal as a change in temperature that caused a space shuttle to explode, because our rubber O-rings are not perfect when it's at 30 degrees. Getting into space is extremely difficult and extremely expensive. And for every pound you put into space, you got to have 10 pounds of fuel. There is almost no way that we could build a base on the moon or on Mars without it being the single biggest monetary expenditure of any country on Earth, including the United States and China. And now that we have China sending satellites around the moon, we had a base on the moon, they'd have told us about it. They'd have said, oh, well, look what you're wasting your money on. Look what your people are lying to you about. They're not doing that. If we had a base on Mars, we would see the carbon dioxide. We would see the off-gassing of whatever civilization we had there. Even if it was a small little settlement, it would be impossible for us to hide that from both Earth-based satellites and other satellites going around the planet.
I know, David, you've heard these theories about there were super soldiers and they flew to the moon. They had bases on the moon. They had bases on Mars. And there's a lot of these people that come back and tell these stories about being a super soldier and fighting enemy extraterrestrials up there on Mars and moon and in outer space. What do you think about those theories, David?
See the smile on my face?
I see the smile. That means ridiculous.
Not good science fiction. Well, see, we have two problems in astronomy and UFOs today. One is too many people want to make a quick buck by telling the most outlandish stories because as the poster in X-Files behind Fox Mulder's desk says, the poster does not say, I want the truth. The poster does not say, I want to know. It says, I want to believe, which is a mistake. Okay. We have to know the truth. You can believe anything. There were some charlatans that were around, a few years ago, who tried to claim that one of them would go to Mars, would be teleported there, spend 20 years there working on God knows what, and then would not only be teleported back, but brought back in time by 20 years. So it looked like no time had passed at all. How convenient.
Yeah.
Like,
now you mentioned time travel in some of your notes here. Do you think we have time travel now? Do you think it's a secret military thing, David?
Well, okay. So if you're asking, can individual humans travel in time? Yes, we do all the time. The most perfect example of that is deja vu, where people can experience an event for a second time that they've already experienced. And the reason it's so bizarre is because you know what's going to happen because you've been there before. But I think the only way we can do that is right now through our dreams. I've visited the future a number of times in my dreams, and some of them have been terrifyingly accurate. I saw a moment where I almost died in my dream, and I wrote it down. I wrote it down in detail, and then I completely forgot about it. And 3 months later, it not only happened just like it was in the dream with some slight, literary differences, but I actually saw people in that situation that I had seen in my dream. And there's no way for me to have done that other than for me to go forward in time and be at that place and see that moment in time and then come back into my body.
You're
so
saying
you're
we
asking,
can do it?
Can we do time travel? Yeah, we do time travel all the time.
Yeah, I've had those lucid dreams. Yeah.
Right. Can we do that as a technological experience? I just don't think we're capable of that yet.
Let me ask you another question there then. Do you trust that the military is telling us straight up what they have? I heard they're 50 years ahead of us.
Okay. So you're old enough to remember the Balkan War during the Clinton administration. Do you remember how many US troops died in that war?
Not exactly. I can't remember.
Take a guess. 50, 100,
50,
200?
I'd say 30, 40.
Two.
Two
people died. You know who those two people were? They were in one of the very first Apache helicopters, which we used in that war, but they were not cleared yet. But the U.S. military-industrial complex, the Pentagon, all those people wanted to get those things into combat, rushed to get them into combat before they were safe. And two pilots wound up dying from one of the crashes, and then they grounded them. You know about the Osprey?
Yeah, I heard about the Osprey. Yeah.
22. That sucker crashed over and over and over again because we didn't wait to make sure it was safe before we put people in it. The U.S. military has a terrible habit of putting things into combat just as soon as they possibly can, whether they're safe or not. So I think if we had flat-sided black triangles the size of a super Walmart, like was seen over Stevensville in 2007 or 2008, on its way to the Bush White House Ranch in Crawfordville, Texas. If we had those, we'd have been using them already.
Yeah, I've seen one.
If we could time travel, we'd have gone back in time and we'd have changed a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
And I just don't think they would hold off because they don't seem to have a habit of doing that.
Yeah, my mom and I, two brothers, saw a giant triangle go over our neighborhood. It covered about 8 or 9 houses, and it was huge. I mean, yes, I saw them, but what now? I didn't know anything about that war. I was guessing 30, 40. I didn't know. I thought maybe it was a secret that I didn't know about, in which they do hide from a lot of people. How many military are killed in experimental combat with other countries? We don't know that number, and so I was just taking a guess. But you said 2. I believe that. Okay.
So I've got 2 interesting little stories that I don't usually tell very often because I don't get much of a chance. I spent a year in Texas, and while I was there, I got to be on a game show that was in its very first filming, called Guilty or Innocent. It was something I think that was the idea of F. Lee Bailey, the famous defense attorney. And the idea was he would present a historical a court case, and you 12 jury members in the game show would have to decide whether the person being represented in this court case was guilty or innocent. And it turns out what he was really doing was travesties of justice. And the ones that you thought for sure were innocent were guilty, and the ones you were sure were guilty were innocent. Okay. And it didn't go anywhere because once you figured that out, there was no secret to the game.
Mm-hmm.
There was a gentleman I met down there who was in the military at the time. He was on leave, so he got to be in the show. And he told me that and this is total hearsay, total, one guy talking to another guy. He said that he had friends of his that had been in a helicopter crash and reported dead in the helicopter crash who had actually died overseas. But they brought the bodies back, loaded them into helicopters, crashed the helicopters, and said, oh, that's too bad. One of the interesting things about the attack on Osama bin Laden was that I think it was 20 members of SEAL Team 6 died in a single crash like a couple of months later. And it seemed peculiar that they had gotten all the way through the Osama bin Laden thing without suffering any casualties. And then 2 months later, a whole bunch of them died.
Yeah, I heard that story. Yeah.
And I don't have the numbers, but I thought that was peculiar. The other thing that was really interesting was back around, I think it was 91 that we did the first Gulf War.
Mm-hmm.
I was working outside of Chicago, and a delivery guy came in, and we had the TV on, and he said, hey, do you guys have any contacts at CNN? And I said, no, why? He says, well, my brother's over there, and he keeps telling me that they're getting shelled by the Iraqis, and there's no coverage of this at all, and they're getting a little pissed off that no one's talking about this. And I said, really? He says, yeah, it's happening like nightly, like daily. So I just took a chance. So I called CNN. You can get their number in Atlanta. Their main number is like 216-2000. Okay. And I thought, okay, that's probably their main switchboard. So I tried 216-2001, and I got an executive's answering machine. And I thought, well, that's cool. Then I tried 2002, got another executive, tried 2003, and I got the phone on the news desk. And I was like, oh, hey, just like, hey, I'm going to be on live in like 5 seconds. What do you want? I said, ask your guy in Saudi Arabia if they're being attacked by Iraqi artillery. He goes, okay, I'll try. Thanks, bye. And he hangs up, and I'm like, gee, who the hell was that I just talked to? And so we're watching CNN, and like 2 minutes later, this guy's on the air, and he's asking his guy in Saudi Arabia, hey, we've had reports that you're suffering from artillery fire from the Iraqis. Would you like to? And they cut the feed.
Well,
I was like, I'll take that as a confirmation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, when they
when they came back, they did not have that correspondent on. They had somebody else, and they did not talk about that ever again.
Okay.
So for operation security, you sometimes have to keep things away from the public sector. You can't talk about everything.
I believe that, yes.
Put people's lives at risk.
Right. I believe that. I was in the military. David, you are so versed in what we're talking about. We're just talking about the military. You have that. You have that in your topics, also the military. But let's go to, I think this is your favorite topic, and I think I'm going to take it to see this drawing behind me, with Stonehenge and the UFO and the robot. That just
yes.
Yeah, that just matches me just fine, because the robot, it says AI, the UFO is a UFO in which I've seen, and then Stonehenge is ancient structures. And you said now we know civilization predated the rise of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley by 6,000 years. We have to reevaluate the massive megalithic structures or sites around the world. Could you tell us a little bit about those, what you found out about those megalithic structures, David?
Sure. I've got a book back on my bookcase that talks about, the world's interest in megaliths. It was written in 1990. It claims that the megaliths were started around 4,000 or 5,000 BC, which points to Stonehenge. They talk about North Africa. They talk about England, France, other places in Europe. They don't mention South America. They don't mention Central America. They don't mention anything in Turkey. They don't mention Göbekli Tepe because that wasn't even common knowledge in 1990. That book's only 30 years old and it's completely out of date. Okay. We now know that there are, and I've got a whole list here of sites, but I'll just start with two that are really fascinating. There's a place in Cusco called Sacsayhuaman, which has been described by the Spanish as a series of concentric stone walls making up a fort. Okay. Couldn't be further from the truth. It's a zigzag series of stone walls that are fit together so precisely you can't fit a razor blade or a piece of paper in between the pieces of stone, which if they were, 3 feet, 4 feet in diameter, that wouldn't be too bad. But some of these stones are freaking huge. They're like 80, 90 tons. And some of them have irregular shapes where the two stones perfectly match those irregular shapes. There is no way that an indigenous culture like the Inca, using non-metal tools, using stone, could have carved those. Not only could they have not carved them, they could not have carved two irregular surfaces that fit together so perfectly unless they were carving both sides at the same time. Okay, we've never seen anybody do that before, but that's the only way those stones could fit together.
So you're saying laser cut, maybe, David?
Well, okay, so I'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, so we've got Sacsayhuaman. There are these three walls. If you look at it top down with the walls facing towards the top, they actually represent the outline of feathers of like an eagle, or like we saw in Göbekli Tepe, possibly a vulture. They look like the outline of feathers, except they're made with monstrously huge stone blocks. Some of the blocks, and this is interesting, the oldest ones along the bottom of the stone have little divots cut out, little rectangular sections removed, almost like somebody was autographing or signing the stones. Later on, there are no longer the divots, but there are nubs that stick out. And the only reason there could be nubs, some people claim it was because they were using geopolymer or concrete, and these were where they extruded the stone. And I don't believe that's true. I think what those nubs represent is this is how much stone was removed to leave this finished surface. The reason the oldest stones have divots taken out is because they cut these stones off of some nearby hills miles away, and they wanted to keep the naturally eroded face that they found on the hills, because whoever these builders were, they really appreciated nature in all of its, ancient glory. So they maintained those, but they couldn't put a nub on that. So instead, they used whatever device they were using and cut a little hole out to leave an image of what the device was that they were using. And the reason I talk about this is because up above the hill, behind where these three walls are, is this complex that's massive. It takes over the entire height of the hill. And there appear to be dozens of structures there where the walls are gone, but the foundations for where the buildings were still remain. And there are a number of sites there where somebody was using this stone cutting technology as if they were practicing. There are places where someone's carved a perfectly straight line 9 feet in the air, just straight across a natural stone wall and straight down for no apparent reason. There are places where it looks like they've done stairways going up into the air. There are big stone boulders about the size of this room where they've done this in intricate little detail with little stone stairs and little stone seats like benches or thrones, to a point where it looks like it's a kid's playground. And what that tells me is that they had stone cutting technology that they were sharing, whoever they were sharing with the indigenous culture and allowing them to learn how to use these stone carving tools and techniques.
Hence the practicing you were talking about. And you said they were up high, lines were up high. Could these be giant? Could they be giants?
They could be. The other problem with this is, so let's say that they had stone cutting technology. Great. How did they move 80 and 90 and 100-ton stone blocks from miles away to put on this hill? Well, whatever it was easy enough that they did it over and over and over again. When you look at the stones from Stonehenge, we can see now that they may have used rollers, and they may have floated them partway up, to where they needed to be, because there's like a stone walkway from Stonehenge going to the north and to the east, where there's another henge area not far from the coast. So it's possible that they brought them over this way. But these stones at Sacsayhuaman and in other places in South and Central America, their quarries are downhill and up the other side of another hill, where you just can't do these things on rollers. It's just not possible.
And this was done,
Ollantaytambo,
yeah.
which is not far away, has the same problem, where they're up on a cliff, and the cliff face just doesn't give you enough room to have 400 guys moving around these 30-ton blocks of stone. So they had some other technology to move these stones that was just as advanced as whatever the stone cutting technology was.
Right, and this happened all over the world in a lot of different megalithic structures you're talking. We're going to take a station ID break. You're listening to United Public Radio Network, FM 105.3 and 107.7 global from beautiful New Orleans. And you're with The Strange Reality with Dave Emmons, and producer is Michelle DeRocher, and she's with us tonight behind the scenes helping us out. And my guest is David White, and he is he's got so much. I guess he's studied so much and researched so much. And we're going from topic to topic, but I actually wanted to show you how much he does know, because he's a sharp guy. I've had him on before. I just love his research. David, tell us a little bit more about this megalithic structure stuff that you're on.
Okay, so there's two things that appear to be interesting enigmas worldwide. One of them are the nubs, these little, they call them sacred chins, that appear on stones somewhere after the first big megalithic stones are in place. Sacsayhuaman is an interesting site because you can see both the rectangular divots that are cut out of the earliest stones, where they were maintaining the natural face of the stone, and the later stones where they were smoothing the faces perfectly, but they left nubs. Those nubs are showing how much stone was removed to get that perfect face. The problem is these nubs are 4 or 5 inches deep or protruding from the stone. That means they were able to take away 4 inches of stone across a giant block. There's a place in China called the Yangsan Quarry, where there is a massive outcropping of stone with these giant, like 2 feet by 2 feet by 1 foot nubs on this outcropping of stone. This is not poured concrete. This is not geopolymer. This is natural stone. And somebody took a foot of stone off for 100 feet in diameter and then cut into the stone directly through to the other side like they were cutting through butter. This is not done by people pounding on stones with other stones. This is not people using, bronze or copper tools, because at that time, nobody in those areas, including South America, had copper or bronze tools. So they were doing something else, okay? You also have sites like Baalbek in Lebanon, where there are 3 stones called the trilithons or the trilithons, which each appear to be 1,000 tons. Okay, that's 5 diesel locomotives in size. There is no way a bunch of humans can move those and then put them up in the air. They're not laying on the ground. There's actually curbstones underneath them, angled curbstones, as if they're showing off how easy it is for them to carve stone. And they put these 3 on top of this. Current archaeologists try to claim that this is Roman because there are Roman works on the top. But the problem is the Romans never moved 1,000-ton blocks of stone like that. There are some pillars that they moved from Egypt that were already carved that are close to 1,000 tons, but nothing like this. And there's 2 other ones in the quarry that have not been removed yet that are even bigger than those 3.
Yeah, we're seeing history being hidden. I watch these documentaries, and a lot of these archaeologists and scientists who've been working on this stuff for years, they do not say anything about ETs, extraterrestrials being involved, or another race being involved that's highly intelligent. They don't allude to that. If you go to Egypt, Sawi Hawass, who's the director of Egyptology there, if you go there and if you do a documentary and if you mention ETs, he throws you out of the country. You're gone. He will not
Okay.
accept the fact that the ETs were involved, David.
Okay. To be fair, we don't have any proof, any hard physical proof that ETs were involved. We do have proof that somebody used an advanced technology to move and shape these stones. If you look at Sacsayhuaman, this is one of the best examples. If you look at the wall, you can tell that they put a stone in one place and then they put a stone next to it. And they carved both of those sides at the same time. Then they put a stone next to that. And sometimes they'll put a stone down from the top that has an angle like that on one side and an angle like that on the other, which means they were able to cut two sides and the bottom at the same time so that they would perfectly fit. Okay. And you can see where some of them curve down like this, and then they put another stone on the top and they curved a cut into the stone underneath it, and the stone underneath goes like this, and then it drops down and goes like this. So they were cutting into the stone below it or beside it while they were putting another stone in place. That's never been done, as far as we know, in any civilization since the Egyptians and the Chinese and the Romans and the Greeks and anybody who was building anything. However,
it makes sense, David. It does, because if civilization has been here for thousands and thousands of years, they might have obtained some technology or intelligence to do this. I could see where there could be a battle against ancient civilization being intelligent and also ETs, David. I get your point on that. Yes.
So we'll get into that. So there is a legend from South America, from the area around what's it called? Tiwanaku. Tiwanaku is a city that used to be a port on Lake Titicaca. And next to it, about a mile away, is this other place called Pumapunku. Pumapunku is the site that looks like it was hit by a tsunami. It's covered in feet of mud and clay, but it also has these massive sandstone blocks that are 30 or 40 feet long that somebody just placed and then put all these other almost cookie cutter like stone blocks on top, which appear to be doorways. It appears that they were creating a series of doorways. We know from around the world that there is a habit of these ancient megalithic builders to build sort of doorways that aren't doorways that don't go anywhere. There's a beautiful one outside of Cuzco that's carved in the side of a sandstone cliff where it's 60 feet flat on both sides, well, all the way across 60 feet, and then another 60 feet up in the air. And in the middle, there's a T-shaped doorway with a little hole, with a little recess in the middle. It's about a 6 foot tall recess into this stone wall. And according to the local legends, the priests used to go up there and put a crystal into that hole, and they would go somewhere. We don't know where they would go, but they would go somewhere.
Yeah, ancient aliens said they were portals.
Right.
I guess,
so,
David. Yeah.
So Lake Titicaca had another legend that I think gives us a clue to what these people were. Their legend was that they were all made and all connected to the god of the sun god. And one day the sun god sent his two children, a brother and sister, who were also husband and wife, pretty much like the Egyptians, where the Egyptians would marry the woman in their bloodline. Right. Okay. So this man and woman were called the children of the sun. And they supposedly left the lake, which is also emblematic of ancient gods like Oannes and Thoth and Viracocha and Quetzalcoatl, who all seem to rise up out of the water and or return to the water. Viracocha, his name actually means foam of the sea, because the last time they saw him, he walked into the Pacific Ocean and disappeared. Okay, so this brother and sister husband-wife team, the children of the sun, had two objects with them. One was called the axe of gold, also known as the axe of the gods. And it was called the axe of the gold, not because it was made out of gold, but because it had a beam that looked like a golden light. We now have plasma cutters that have an invisible beam, but when it contacts the material it's going to sublimate, it changes into this brilliant light that could be identified as gold. These plasma cutters that we have now do what's called sublimating, which means it actually transforms solid material from a solid directly into a gas, bypassing the liquid state entirely, which means that you have no debris left behind. The biggest mystery about places like the Long caves also in China supposedly had something like 2 million cubic feet removed inside these caves, except there's not a single piece of debris found anywhere. You look at all of these stones that were cut at Sacsayhuaman, or places like Ollantaytambo, where we find these giant blocks. There's no debris left behind. And if they were using something like a plasma cutter, which fits with the description that they had of this axe of gold, then that could be the device that they were using to cut the stone. What's interesting is, since the very first image of the handbag of the gods is in the hand of Oannes, the fish scale covered god of Sumeria, he's carrying a handbag, which could fit into the concept of the axe of gold.
And there's been a lot of statues. Yeah, a lot of statues with a handbag. Yeah. I was going to ask you, they also did melting of stone, because they said some stone looked like it's melted together. And did you see those steps that were melted? I forget where it's at. It's over in the Mediterranean, I believe. Yeah.
Dendera in Egypt.
Yeah.
Yes, except the problem with that is that's, I don't believe, really melted, because none of the walls are melted. And some of the stone there is around a corner and down the hall and around a corner again. And if there was something hot enough to melt that stone, it would have melted a whole heck of a lot more than just those steps. I think there's something else going on in there, and it's not quite understood. Now, if you're saying, is there melted stone? There absolutely is. There's two kinds of melted stone. There is scorched stone, and then there's stone that cuts with something that leaves drip marks behind like candle wax. There are two places at Sacsay where we see this. One of the cornerstones at Sacsay has what's called the snake, and somebody melted a series of interconnected circles into one of these giant boulders, into one of these giant stones that looks like it was melted with a blowtorch. And you can see how there's a lip, and the lip has melted stone connected to it. There's also this really fascinating stone puma or cat, about yay big, made out of this really black material, I think is andesite, which is very hard, like granite, like marble. And somebody delicately carved this cat out of this stone. And you can see when you zoom in that it has drip marks where the stone was melted. Now, this is not stone softening. This is stone melting. This is high temperature. And there are other places, but not as interesting as those two at Sacsayhuaman, where we've seen what appears to be melted stone. The problem is, most theories these days suggest this was done by solar flares, which would be possible, except solar flares, to compare them to Obi-Wan Kenobi's comments in Star Wars, are never that precise. Okay? Mm-hmm. It's impossible for a solar flare to affect one stone in a wall and not affect any of the stones nearby. That's something intelligently controlled. Directly. Now, there is an interesting story. Graham Hancock in Fingerprints of the Gods, about page 47 or 48 or so, he's talking about Viracocha and the legends of Viracocha when he arrived in that region in South America. He apparently had others with him in some flying craft. And at one point, the locals were upset because they thought he was bad juju, he was a black magician or whatever. So they were going to stone him to death. And Viracocha apparently fell on his knees, raised his hands, and begged for holy fire from the sky. And when the fire rained down, it freaked the locals out, and they said, okay, we're just kidding. Let's be friends. Don't kill us.
Oh,
And at that point, that legend fits up with another really interesting site called Tanis in Egypt. Tanis is a completely destroyed city. All of its biggest blocks are scattered like toys. And one of the largest statues has these remarkable scorch marks that appear to be coming down from the sky. But again, they're very localized. They only hit one part of the statue. They have to be 2,000 or 3,000 degrees because they literally melted the stone, they scorched the stone. But there's no indication that it affected that stone or that stone. There's another one that's a rectangular stone where it comes sideways. So that's not a solar flare. That's somebody messing around with technology. Now, this gets into a very interesting theory that not too many people have considered. We have to go back a little ways. So a number of these ancient sites appear to have been abandoned, almost like somebody stopped for lunch and never came back. Ollantaytambo, which is also in South America, built up on the side of this hill, has 6 or 7 really beautifully placed large 30, 40-ton blocks with little intricate vertical ones between them, which we think are designed to absorb seismic activity so that they can shift and they don't crack, which is brilliant. But there are a dozen other stones all laying around, and another one down the hill in the middle of this valley between where the side of the cliff is and all the way up on the other side equally as high where the quarry is, where they got these stones, miles away.
right.
And it looks like they brought one of these stones and then just stopped and left it there. The locals call it the lazy stone because it was too lazy to get up the hill. But it looks like somebody just stopped. Now, other researchers have claimed that this site looks like it was exploded, except there's no scorch marks, there's no burn marks, there's no broken stones. Some of these stones are beautifully carved. Some of them have these really interesting rectangular nubs that go for like 10 feet and that are 3 feet high and go in about 4 or 5 inches. So somebody left a really beautiful extruded rectangular nub.
We're still talking about Egypt, right? Do you think
We're talking about the whole globe encompassing advanced civilization that was in the process of building megalithic stonework all around the world simultaneously.
right? And
So
these incidents appeared in most of these places, like the explosions or melted rock. There were battles,
Well,
you think?
no, not always. See, like Ollantaytambo doesn't have any evidence of burnt or melted stone. It just looks like it never got finished. There's another place in Egypt called the Serapeum, which is an underground complex where there are these massive 80-ton granite boxes with 30-ton lids that appear to have been brought into these niches underground and then polished while they were underground in the dark in these little narrow niches. Now, you and I, if we were doing this, we'd polish them outside where it was easy. Whoever moved these things in there waited until they were in place before they polished, which means that they were doing it with some sort of electric light because there's no soot on the ceilings in there, which means
Right.
they weren't using torches.
Right.
Now, one of the interesting things is the main hallway has one of these black granite boxes sitting in the middle of the hallway like they broke for lunch and never came back. And they just left it there. And there are places over and over and over again all around the world where it looks like they stopped working and never came back. Now, we know that there was a massive cataclysm that appeared to end the Lesser Dryas event. Something crashed into the glaciers in Canada and Greenland hard enough and hot enough that it rose the ocean levels 300 feet in a very short period of time. It's very possible that the civilization that was here didn't have a lot of warning and realized as soon as they saw this thing coming, you got an hour, get everything in their boats and let's go. And they got up and left. Now, when you look at Tanis, what Tanis looks like is it looks like somebody got pissed off and took whatever cutting torches they had and started waving them around. Like, what are you doing leaving? Get over here, take us with you. That's what it looks like. There are other sites in South America where the same thing appears to have happened, where they melted a couple of stones, but not the whole wall, just a few. There are scorch marks in other places in Peru where it's the bottom of a wall, but not the top or the sides. It looks like they were angry, and it matches up with the Viracocha story, where the locals were mad at Viracocha and then fire came out of the sky. So if you look at, for example, the story of Noah, which is written down by the Israelites in their Hebrew language, somewhere between 1500 and 500 BC, that may be a story of something that happened in 10,000 BC, that 8,500 to 9,000 years prior. Things get a little garbled between the event and the writing it down. So the event that maybe Graham Hancock is reporting, that the Inca told the Spanish conquistadors, maybe they're sort of misremembering their history.
Have you ever studied the Egyptian books that they found about? I guess they found them 1,200 years ago, and the Egyptian books talks about Jesus and talks about the beginnings of time and everything, and they're saying that Jesus was a shapeshifter and that he was a star being. In these Egyptian books, they talk about. Also, the interesting story about Egypt is Osiris and Isis and Thoth. You talked about them. They could have been aliens from all indications. Is that what you're taking, David? And what are the pyramids for? Tell me what the pyramid.
Okay, so there's about 9 things in that question.
Yeah, it's the unpackaged. Yeah.
I like Fingerprints of the Gods because Graham Hancock takes the time to compare the legends of these handful of apparently white-skinned, pale-skinned, bearded gods. Viracocha, Oannes, Thoth, they were all scribes of the god. The only reason the Egyptians knew anything about their pantheon was because Thoth taught them. He was the guy that came up out of the ocean and taught them everything. The interesting thing about the Egyptian language is that with the first dynasty, which is roughly 3,500 to 4,000 BC, their language was as complete and as complex as their language was ever going to be. Like somebody taught them from a primer, from a book. And from that point on, they stopped using every so often certain key words or phrases or hieroglyphs, and their language becomes less and less complex during the years. That's not the way most languages work. Most languages have a proto-language, and then they get more and more complex as you need more terms to describe things. The Egyptian language is exactly the opposite. And as far as I know, it's the only one that's like that, because it fits in with what we know now about Thoth, who came there and taught them everything they needed to know. Okay, so I was going into this idea that if there was an ancient civilization who had advanced technology to cut stones in a way that we can't do today, who also had the technology to move these stones in a way that we can't move today. It's not just a matter of moving an 80-ton block of stone over 10 miles from a quarry down a valley and up the other side. It's putting them close together and holding them there while you cut both sides to perfectly match and then put them in place. That's not done by a bunch of guys putting their shoulders against these stones and moving them out of the way and then cutting a little bit and then laying them back. It's done with a whole different level of technology. So at some point, there is this awareness that this civilization is going to end because there's something coming from the sky. It could be that little globe that's balanced on top of the vulture, the Cygnus image on Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe, where it looks this big in the sky. That's how big the sucker was as it was coming in. And they recorded it on there so that people wouldn't forget. This is why we're here. This is what happens. They're all gone. We're left.
Yeah, the series of questions I asked you a while ago, the last one was about the pyramids. What do you think? There's pyramids all over the world. What do you think they were built? What were they built for? I mean, what's their purpose?
So when did Yahweh arrive to visit the Israelites? Do you remember this in the Old Testament? So Moses had met Yahweh, and he had had some conversations. Then he goes back to Egypt and he asks Pharaoh to be Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, no, that job's taken. Get out of here. So Moses goes back, talks to Yahweh again. And Yahweh says, just bring the guys they don't want. So supposedly he goes back a second time and says, I just want the Israelites. And Pharaoh's like, sure, okay, fine, take them out of here. At that point, they go into Sinai, the desert, and supposedly they wander for 40 years. The problem is you can't wander in the Sinai for 40 years. It's about the size of Illinois, or not even quite that big, Indiana perhaps. But at one point they find this mountain, and Yahweh says, I'm going to come and talk to you directly. Make sure you are clean. Make sure you have been covered in incense, which means that they're trying to get rid of whatever pests and bugs and germs and diseases Moses might be carrying, so that he doesn't infect whoever God is, which means God ain't a God, he's mortal. And he meets him on top of Mount Sinai, on top of a mountaintop. And when Yahweh arrives, he arrives with smoke and thunder and shakes the ground to the point where the Israelites are terrified. Now, the interesting thing is, back where Abraham and his people came from, they came from Ur, they came from Sumeria, where they built ziggurats. Ziggurats were these flat-topped pyramids that were designed to be the place where the priest, and only the priest, could go up to the top and talk to the gods. And again, whenever they did that, they would purify themselves, they would ritually bathe, and they'd be covered in incense. So if there were any bugs around, the bugs would leave coughing. Okay. Again, showing that their gods were not immortal, their gods were mortal and susceptible to human pests and plagues and diseases.
That's a great story there, David. I've never heard that angle about being cleansed and everything. Yeah, that's pretty neat. So, I just learned that. Thank you, David.
So there's a place in the Southwestern Pacific, Gunung Padang, that appears to be a man-made terraced extinct volcano that is made with hundreds, if not thousands, of these volcanic blocks that each of them weigh up to 80 tons. And they were terracing this hillside like we would use Legos, or Lincoln Logs would be a better example. Except the only place you can get these stones is from an island 20 or 30 miles away, and there's no way that the indigenous civilization with their reed boats could put an 80-ton block of stone into a reed boat and then carry it up a hill. But again,
that's those black rocks that they're all piled up, look like dominoes or whatever. Okay.
Yes. So we have around the world these sites where there appear to be plateaus, platforms, truncated pyramids, where the gods would come and meet a select cleansed individual, and that individual would then go talk to everybody else. The other interesting thing that we're now learning about the three pyramids at Giza, most of the outer casing stones are gone. The ones that were on the Great Pyramid was this beautiful white Tura limestone that they say was polished to an optician's, fineness. It was, they assume, they theorized that it was polished so well that this was possibly the first stone in history, the first building in history that didn't cast a shadow, that actually reflected light up into the sky. And it was made so perfectly that it's not actually four-sided, it's eight-sided, because each of the sides is concave. So it actually focused the light up into the sky, which is, brilliant. No one else has ever done that. No other Egyptian pyramid has ever been built like that. But the other interesting thing is the second and the third pyramid also had lower casing stones on the outside of red granite. Not the Great Pyramid, the two Western ones. And people are like, well, why would they do that? Well, because they're built into the side of this plateau. The plateau to the west is actually excavated down to make it flat. And it appears that there was a time in the Giza Plateau area where it was heavily inundated with rain. That's one of the great, amazing new investigations that we're trying to still confirm, that suggests that the erosion in the Sphinx enclosure is not from sand and it's not from floods, it's from rain. The problem is the last time we had that kind of rain in Egypt was probably around 8,000 BC, which is only about 6,000 years prior to when the pyramids and the Sphinx were built. So that doesn't jive. And
No, it doesn't.
Zahi Hawass would be very upset
Yeah.
if I tried to suggest, which he was very upset that people suggested this was rain. That means the Sphinx is far older than the Egyptians. The other thing that's interesting is the Sphinx enclosure, the mound itself is made out of bedrock, out of limestone. And somebody cut these stones and placed them between the Sphinx and the Nile and made what's called the Sphinx Temple. There's another one right next to it called, I think, the Valley Temple. And they're made out of these massive blocks that are way much bigger than they needed to be. Some of these are 200 tons, but none of them have any carvings on them because whoever built these originally didn't need to carve. They didn't need to mar the surface with engravings. Same thing.
Yeah. Let me pose this question to you, David.
Sure.
I heard that there's a bottom room underneath the Sphinx, and Jesus actually went there and talked to some high priests. They met there at the bottom entrance. There's a room there at the bottom of the Sphinx. Do you know of any modern technology that has actually said there's a room there that they're looking at?
Well, the last time I talked to Jesus, he says, "Don't believe everything you hear." Well, there's Edgar Casey believed that there was a library in that area, and I want to say he thought it was under the Sphinx.
Yes.
The problem is that limestone, karst limestone, is very susceptible to erosion and leaks like a sieve. And the last place you want to put a library is on a plateau where you've got rainwater coming from the west and enough rainwater that it's eroding the sides of the Sphinx enclosure. You don't want to put a library under. The place you do want to put a library is up above in the Great Pyramid.
Okay, that's what those rooms were, I guess. And they've been emptied since, right, David?
We know that there are other rooms inside the Great Pyramid, and we know that there are ones that we don't think have been entered yet, but you can't trust Zahi. He may have opened them up already.
Yeah.
We do know that there are cavities in the bedrock below the Sphinx. Oh, there's also, so there's a thing called the Osiris shaft, which hadn't been open to the public until just a few years ago. So the Osiris shaft is this massive, I think it's 30-foot square cut straight down into the ground. It goes about 100 feet straight down. The only way in is through a very rickety ladder. You get down to a level where there is a box just like the granite boxes at the Serapeum, except this box looks like it blew up from the inside and has this black goo in it. I'll get to that in a second. Okay. So if you wander around in here, there's some other hallways and things, but then there's another cut that goes straight down again, and then there's a second level. And then if you go down below that, there's a third level that at this point is about 200 feet below ground. And down there is a sarcophagus that I'm not sure has ever been opened. The last picture I saw, it was fully flooded, and there was a guy standing on the lid, and there was water up to his knees or something. Mm-hmm. It's possible that they have opened this up. It's possible that they claimed they've opened it up and haven't. The interesting thing about this is, so this is supposed to be the Osiris shaft, and some people think that this box is Osiris's sarcophagus. We don't know. How did they move a box that big and heavy down a shaft and down a shaft and down a shaft? And
Osiris was very interesting from what I studied. He could have been, he was his brother who fought him over the kingship. He wanted to be the king. So he killed him. Yes. And
then tore him apart, and then I had to go and find the parts and put them back together.
Yeah, and which tells me, could he be a robot, AI? Scary thought.
It's not clear. So here's one thing that's really interesting about all this. By the way, for anybody who doesn't believe in time travel, I can't believe an hour and a half has already passed.
Yeah, it's fast, buddy.
There's an excellent book by, I think it's Andrew Collins called The Gods of Eden. And he talks about the Egyptian legends as taught to them by Thoth, where they discuss Zept Hepi, which is the first time, meaning the first time that the land had the waters recede and show them dry land. At that point, the land was ruled by these bird-headed gods, which bears some remarkable resemblance to the birds carved on the T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe and elsewhere. And after some thousands of years, these bird-headed gods left and gave control over at least this part of Egypt to a group whose Egyptian name means the crew. And this term in Egyptian is basically the guys who row the boats for the pharaoh, uses that same term, the crew. And after some 1,000 years, those guys decide they're bored also, and they leave it to the children of the crew. And that's the gods we know of as the Egyptian pantheon: Osiris, Isis, Set, Thoth, and all the others. They're the third generation. They're not even the first generation of gods. So if they're gods, who the heck were the other ones?
Right. And I also heard that these gods, or little g in the gods in Egypt, they actually wanted the high priest to deal with the people because they didn't want to deal with them. Like you said, maybe they were unclean and they didn't want to be around them. So they had these high priests talk to them, and they let the high priest handle the multitudes, or the people, the mass. So yeah, they kept away from the people. I guess these extraterrestrials, whatever. And it's fascinating what you're talking about, that these societies have probably learned or been taught by the ETs, and they become intelligent and was able to do the work that you're talking about, the stonework and everything. And the pyramids, there's also rumor that it was a power plant and it transmitted power or communications around the world. What do you know about that, David?
Well, I talked to Chris Dunn about this. I talked to David Hatcher Childress about this. David Hatcher Childress has a bookstore and a nice clubhouse in the middle of vast miles of cornfield in the middle of Illinois, and I've been there a bunch of times and talked to both of them. The problem I have with the pyramid power plant concept is that the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, was never airtight or watertight. It could not have held liquid to a point where it could push things back and forth. It just doesn't seem to be capable of doing the kind of things that they would like it to do in order for it to be a power plant. That being said, there are some unique features of the Great Pyramid that a lot of people don't realize. So I was mentioning before how the central and the western pyramids have pink granite casing stones. We believe that was to protect them from the runoff of the water from the higher level of the plateau to the west. And by the time that water got to where the Great Pyramid was, they didn't need that cladding. So that suggests that those pyramids were built at a time when water erosion was a problem, which has to be 8,000 BC or earlier.
Yeah.
There is an interesting feature of the Great Pyramid that most people don't notice unless you read this book called, I don't know what it's called, but it's one of my books up there. The Great Pyramid Decoded. I think that's it. I want to be sure. Hold on. No, it's Secrets of the Great Pyramid by a guy named Peter Tompkins.
I heard about that.
One of his pages, it's a fascinating book. He goes into a lot of the history of the archaeology of the Great Pyramid. One of the things he does that I've never seen anywhere else is he shows a view of the inside passageways from the north. Okay, most of the time, in fact, almost all the time, if you do a Google search right now, passageways of the Great Pyramid, it always shows it to you from the east, looking west. So you see, you see the descending passageway, then you see the bottom passageway that parallels the surface. It goes off to the south, then you see the ascending passageway with a couple of granite plugs, and then it goes off to the Queen's Chamber. Then you see the Grand Gallery up from there, and then it goes to the King's Chamber, and then there's the relieving chambers over the King's Chamber. That's what you see all the time. But if you turn it sideways, you see all of those passageways in a straight line down to the bottom. And then you don't see how it goes off to the south, but you do see this unfinished room at the bottom going off to the west. Okay. And then in the middle, you see where the Queen's Chamber is, which is a little rectangle going to the west. And above that, you see the King's Chamber, which is a little rectangle with 5 levels above it that looks, when you take it all together, like a human being with a spine and feet and a chest and a head and a 5-layered crown. That's not a
Interesting.
mistake. That's on
Interesting.
purpose.
Wow.
That's not the Egyptians. The Egyptians
Yeah.
never did before.
Yeah.
Somebody was doing that to see if an advanced civilization that followed them could figure this out. Okay. I'll give you another interesting thing about the Great Pyramid. There's only one thing that ever was found inside the Great Pyramid, except for 2 objects that were found in one of the air shafts going off to the north. The only thing that's ever really been in there that we know of for certain is the empty sarcophagus in the King's Chamber, which used to be in the middle of the room. It wasn't pushed off to the left side. It was right in the very middle. And we think it had a top on it. It had a cap, but we've never found that. There was an interesting fellow who did a YouTube video a couple of years ago that I found fascinating, where he suggested maybe somebody snuck into the Great Pyramid, found the lid for the sarcophagus, and decided, we want to prove that we were in here, so they wanted to take that with them. The sarcophagus itself was too heavy, so they just took the lid. The problem was they couldn't bring it down the ascending passageway because there's these granite plugs. So they got as far as they could where the granite plugs were, and then they dug off to the side and then dug straight out. And that's what we now think is the entrance passageway, but it was really an exit passageway. And 2 of the elements in the passageway seem to bear that in mind. One of them is that when you go out to the west and then turn to go north, it makes an exaggeratedly big turn, like bigger than it would need to be if it's just a couple of people walking out.
When did that happen,
as
David?
you're going to the east, or sorry, when you're going to the north, there's this giant block that they just couldn't cut through. So they cut around it, but just enough for maybe 1 or 2 people to pass, and just above it. So if you're carrying something out that's rectangular, you could carry something not like this, but either like this or like this.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be the lid of the sarcophagus.
So when did this happen? Does this happen thousands of years ago?
Well, no, we believe that there was an Arab leader by the name of Al-Mahmud who did this around 800 AD. But it's not clear if he was the one that dug this out or if he just claimed to have dug it out. It's possible it was his father too. There's some legends that say that he is the one that popularized it. He didn't just do it. He was just the first one that talked about it. Okay. Now, fast forward to the year 2010. So in 2010 in Egypt, there is the Arab Spring, which is going on not just in Egypt, but in Libya and a bunch of other countries in Africa and other places. And the civil unrest is so bad that you can't count on the police or the military to protect anything. So civilians actually had to make a human chain around the museum in Cairo to protect it from being looted. One night, according to this story, which I have had confirmed online, there was a group of people that showed up dressed in military gear, all in black, carrying weapons, but with no identifying insignia of any kind, with heavy equipment. They located a specific site near the Great Pyramid that was rectangular, that was buried in a shallow area under the sand, dug whatever it was up, put it on a big truck, and got the hell out of there. There was a story that I read back in 2010 online that showed a before and after satellite picture where the locals described what they saw, and this area where there used to just be flat sand, and next to it there's a shallow rectangular opening. And I think somebody found the lid for the great sarcophagus.
You think it was the lid? I heard that story before, but I never really found out exactly what it was, David.
So it took me years, but I finally found some people online who admitted that, yes, they had heard this story from the locals. Yes, it appeared to be a bunch of guys dressed in black. And yes, they did have weapons and gear, but nobody knows exactly, who they were. So in my second novel, I've got a series that's going to be under the name The Eternal Horizons Stories. The first one's subtitled On the Trail of the Templar Treasure. In the second one, I'm going to use this event, and if it turns out it's true and somebody wants to shut me up, maybe they'll tell me what the real thing is, and then I can pretend like, oh yeah, I knew about it all along. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Now that we see that Oak Island is one of the #1 shows, and they talk about they're actually getting into the Knights Templar doing all this. They're finding out more and more. Now you're into the Knights Templar. Matter of fact, you're part of your address is Templar, whatever. But I won't get into that. But tell us about the Knights.
I'll give it to you. It's templarscribe2@gmail.com.
Okay, all right.
Send me your questions. Send me your stories.
Yeah, I didn't know.
Send
if you
me
wanted
your agent
public.
referrals.
Yeah.
I need an agent. I could take 1 or 2 right now.
Okay.
So
now tell us about the Knights Templar, David.
How much time do we have? Do we have another 2 hours?
No.
14-minute version.
No,
okay, we'll make this a quick version. So a lot of people think the Knights Templar formed up, went to Jerusalem, played around, and came back. And it's much more interesting than that. Bernard of Clairvaux picked 2 knights who had served during the First Crusade that liberated Jerusalem in 1099. He picked these 2 veterans and sent them back to Israel, sent them to Jerusalem to do reconnoitering. When they came back, they hired at least another 7 knights and an unknown number of men-at-arms, sergeants, scribes, clerks, maybe some priests, and went back to the Holy Land and asked the first king of Jerusalem, who I think was Baldwin I, hey, we would like to hang out here. We don't really want to do any fighting. We just want to hang out around the Temple Mount. And Baldwin basically said, get out of here. I'm trying to run a war. I'm trying to protect this place. If you don't want to fight, I don't need you. Baldwin then died a mysterious death through poisoning. Baldwin II, when he was asked the same thing by the Templars, said, sure, guys, whatever you want. I don't want to have any trouble. Please leave me alive. They were given command of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a building on top of the Temple Mount to the south side, which is directly above this giant natural cave called the Cave of Solomon, or the Stables of Solomon, where supposedly he kept horses. We know from English archaeologists who went through the same caves that the Knights Templar must have gone through, that they left behind some relics that prove the Templars were down there, including spurs, I think it was a lead cross, and the hilt of a sword. And at some point, after they're mucking around beneath the Temple Mount for 9 years, they send a message back to Bernard of Clairvaux. And in this message, they say, our mission is a success. We are returning, and we have placed a guard on our train, meaning their wagon train, to protect us from all challengers, both earthly and ecclesiastical. Temporal and ecclesiastical was their terms, meaning that whatever they brought back was not only valuable to, thieves and robbers, but also valuable to the church. Okay, when they come back, whatever they've done, they're so successful that at that point, Bernard of Clairvaux goes to the Pope and says, you will make these guys special. Not only will they be able to charge taxes, which nobody else was ever able to do other than the Jews in the Middle Ages, but they also didn't have to pay any taxes to the church. And what's interesting is from that point on, the Knights Templar then begin to do the first banking that we've seen in medieval Europe. But they did it through like a hand check, where you would give your money to one of the preceptories, one of the Knights Templar commanderies throughout the region. And they would give you a piece of paper saying, we owe you this much money. Show this in Jerusalem, and you will get your money back, minus a slight handling fee. The thing is, it was using a code that hadn't been seen since before the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in 71 AD, which means that somehow they found Jewish documents that predated the end of the Jewish occupation of the Temple Mount in 71 AD, which were translated by Templar friends, the Jews in southern France, which they had protected because the Templars knew something that the other Christians didn't know. And soon after that, we get the first stories about the Holy Grail. except the Holy Grail has nothing to do with a cup. It has nothing to do with the Last Supper. It has something to do with a plate called a graal, Graal, which again is a term from southern France. And the graal, which is a platter that allows you to have sauces or syrup over usually a dessert over a meat.
David, I was asked to ask you this question. Do you know Freddie Silva? He first Templar Nation. He had that, I guess he wrote that book about it, and that they were in Jerusalem for a long time before the Templars even got there.
Before they were the Templars. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you know about Freddie Silva?
I've seen his books. I don't believe I'm that familiar with what his theories are, unfortunately.
Yeah. They were set up in Portugal. They'll set up in Portugal. But I'll look into them before we talk next. I promise you that. They were set up in Portugal. It's said here, Port de Grail.
Right.
Yeah. So there's so much here that being told, and that's okay.
So I'll try to make it really short. So what the Templars did with the Grail stories, the Graal stories, was they were telling a story about a single wafer that shone brighter than the sun, and that would heal anybody who needed a great healing, which the Fisher King, which is where the Grail is first presented through the first Grail story. This wafer bears a remarkable resemblance to something we now know as monatomic gold. And monatomic gold is a powder that when it transfers from regular gold into monatomic gold, it gives off a brilliant light. Okay. And it's possible that that is what is known as manna, because there was something like that the Egyptians used to give to their pharaohs,
right,
that gave them longer life and allowed them to get into heaven, and apparently is superconductive. And we know that a pot of manna was one of the three elements placed in the Ark of the Covenant, and that might have been what allowed it to levitate. Really? There's a great book. One of the best books I've ever read is Lost Secrets of the Sacred Ark by Lawrence Gardner, who gets all into that story. And it's fascinating because it suggests that the Ark of the Covenant was made using a superconductive material made out of gold that had been infused with enough electricity that, 4 or 5 lightning bolts worth, that transformed it into a material where gold is toxic if you eat it, but monatomic gold is not toxic. And that's one of the legends. That's one of the stories that the Knights Templar were trying to pass along. And because they couldn't pass it along, it becomes the basis for alchemy. And that's why we have people looking for the alchemist stone. And it wasn't to change lead into gold, it was to change gold into monatomic.
Manna from heaven.
It goes into a whole different series of stories on its own in that direction.
Yeah. Manna from heaven, right?
Yep. Yeah. Well, not exactly from heaven, but yeah.
Yeah, that's what fed them for 40 years, the manna. I always often wondered, and they actually developed a machine that could make manna. Did you see that? Somebody come up with a machine that made manna out of air.
I've seen that. I don't believe that's the way it works. If you read Lost Secrets of the Sacred Ark, he goes into how you can change gold into monatomic gold. You just have to apply a tremendous amount of electricity. There was a temple on the top of this mountain in the Sinai desert where there were chambers full of this powder. And this archaeologist, I think he was an English archaeologist, thought it was ashes from sacrificial burn piles. So he was throwing it up into the air to see if there were any little bits of bone or debris left behind, when he was basically wasting this incredibly precious, incredibly valuable monatomic gold. So it's very likely that this is what this was.
Out of all the research you've done about these megalithic structures around the world, what are the most fascinating ones to you in the last couple of minutes or so? Tell us what fascinated you the most, David.
Well, the fact that we can see stones like at Sacsayhuaman, where they're placed so perfectly together that you can't fit a blade of grass or a razor blade in between them. Yet they have curving lines. Some of them are beautifully curving lines, and there's no way to do that with any instrument that we know of other than something like the laser cutter. The other thing that's really interesting is not far from Sacsayhuaman in Cusco is a place called the Coricancha, which is supposedly the navel of the world. Oh, let me get to this real quick. I'll try to do this in 60 seconds or less.
All right.
The second object that the man and woman, the children of the sun, carried with them from Lake Titicaca was a golden staff that supposedly would show them where their holy city was to be founded. Okay, so they would walk north. They walked all the way from Bolivia into the middle of Peru to found Cusco by pushing this staff into the ground. And if it didn't go in, they knew it wasn't the right place. And at one point, it sank completely into the ground, and that was going to be their holy city. And that's where Cusco was founded. The interesting thing about Cusco is it's directly in between, on a straight line between Giza and Easter Island. Except Easter Island is 2,000 miles off into the Pacific. And it's almost impossible that anybody from Peru ever knew that that island existed. There's nothing near it. But we now know that that Easter Island has the same type of megalithic stonework that you find at Cusco. So somebody knew that Easter Island was there, and somebody knew where Giza was, and they had these people walk until they were right in between those 2 points and told them, make your city right there. So they were specifically putting that city on a straight line that stretched for, 5,000 miles.
Okay, we're just about at the end of the show. I want you to tell people where they can find out your information and any websites or books that you're working with, David.
Well, if you go to vocal.media and look for David White, there are 2 David Whites on that site. One of them has 1 story, one of them has like 30. I'm the guy with the 30 stories. You can find me on networkisa.org. It's the International Screenwriters Association. I have a book called Eternal Horizons on the Trail of the Knights of the Templar Treasure. Like I said, any agents want to hook me up with a good representation, I'm always down for that. You can also send me questions. I don't have no problem. TemplarScribe2, number 2, @gmail.com, all one word.
Okay, maybe you can help me with this sci-fi book that I'm writing. You might be able to write a screenplay for it. I needed it. It's my 4th book. Okay, we're gonna.
I don't have 35 other projects I'm working on.
Yeah, I know. You're okay. You're not too busy. Okay, but I'm busy just with what I'm doing. But we're going to close the show out after this, and you've been listening to United Public Radio Network, FM 105.3 and 107.7 globally from beautiful New Orleans, and Strange Reality with Dave Emmons and my terrific guest, David Thomas White. And he's a great guy, knowledgeable. I mean, he just rattles this knowledge off. I just love it. You just come out with all this information. Thank you so much, David, for being on the show. And we want to wish everybody a good night. Hope you enjoyed the show. You get a chance to watch this. Do so. Thank you very much.
Be happy, everyone.
Yeah, there you go. Be happy.